this year, in American Studies, we have studied various groups of people and covered the struggles of them. But certain groups have not had the opportunity for their stories to have been told. Among them are soldiers. Although we study the wars they fought in, we do not study those who fought in them. Wars shaped America both economically and culturally, but usually we leave out how war affects us in one way, mentally. We owe it to the brave men and women who served our nation to share their stories and speak of the issues that they face today.
Currently, one of the largest problems soldiers face is post-traumatic stress disorder. After vets return from fighting a war abroad, many of them have to face another battle at home to stay in control of their lives. It's affecting more soldiers than ever before, and we have the technology to treat it correctly. It is not being utilized to its full potential. But in order for us to help these heroes, we must know exactly what they're facing. Thus, it is important that we learn the true effects of PTSD.
Today we know that post-traumatic stress disorder occurs after you experience severe trauma or a life-threatening event. It's normal for your mind and body to be in shock after such an event, but this normal response becomes PTSD when your nervous system gets stuck at the event. Your brain is unable to return to its normal state of balance and you're unable to move on from the event. There are a few categories of symptoms one with PTSD can feel. Arousal symptoms include irritability, angry outbursts without provocation, recklessness, self-destructive behavior, and self-harm. These symptoms lead to effects that touch every area of an individual's life, leaving virtually nothing unscathed. The longer that PTSD exists without treatment, the greater the effects of PTSD on a person's life. The most common effects of the post-traumatic stress disorder may include eating disorders, paranoia, difficulty regulating emotions, inability to maintain stable relationships, depression, anger, difficulty feeling emotions, guilt, substance abuse, social phobia, difficulty maintaining jobs, self-harms, suicidal thoughts or attempts. This is only a small number of the horrible effects people can feel from this disorder. The only way to recover from PTSD is to transition out of the mental and emotional war zone you're still living in, and to help your nervous system become unstuck. Today, we know that can be done through therapy and exposure, but our way of understanding has not always been so advanced. In World War I, millions of veterans suffered due to how little we knew then.
Technological advancements made World War I different from any conflict before it. Artillery shells could strike dozens of soldiers at any time, or an entire brigade could be poisoned in seconds. These horrors affected vets in ways that earlier, more strategic and planned wars did not. In the wake of World War I, some veterans returned wounded, but not with obvious physical injuries, and many doctors came up with theories as to what was wrong with them. Among them was English physician Charles Myers, who wrote the first paper on shell shock in 1915. He wrote that a poor morale and defective training were the most important factors in receiving shell shock. It was falsely assumed that soldiers could snap out of acting traumatized. So soldiers were exposed to extreme treatments that involved trying to shock them into returning their brains to normal. This all stemmed back from the theory that shell shock was a personal failure rather than an unavoidable condition that can develop. An example of the brutal treatment was written about in the memoirs of Louis Yealand, a British physician. After 9 months of unsuccessfully treating his patient, with treatments including electric shocks to the neck, cigarettes being put out on the patient's tongue, and hot plates being placed at the back of his throat, Yealand boasted of telling the patient, "You will not leave this room until you are talking as well as you ever did. No, not before. You must behave as the hero I expect you to be." It is estimated that up to 20% of World War I veterans had PTSD, yet none of them got adequate treatment. In fact, the treatment described is so counterproductive that it likely led to veterans suffering from additional PTSD from their treatment. One of those affected by the Great War was Reese Melvin Russell, a young man whose innocence was lost during the Great War. His combat diary narrates his experience being in the trenches, including being gassed during the German offensive. His daughter Frances writes that after the war, "My father could no longer relate to the world he left behind." He suffered from alcoholism, insomnia, and for the rest of his life he was unable to connect with the rest of his family. He also was unable to keep a steady job for his entire adult life. What he saw and experienced across the Atlantic and war-ravaged Europe changed Russell, and he was never quite the same. When his children came home from school with history lessons involving World War I, he would not allow the mention of it in his presence. Unfortunately, in this era, no major advancements were made in treating PTSD, and it would be another 60 years before anyone made it.
The first big sign of progress with PTSD came in 1980 when it was first recognized as a health condition, just 5 years after the Vietnam War. Meaning, Vietnam veterans with these symptoms were the first to have the term PTSD coined for them. In 1983, Congress requested that VA conduct a study on the prevalence of PTSD and other post-war psychological problems among Vietnam veterans. This was the first study to evaluate the prevalence of PTSD among veterans and became known as the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. The NVVRS brought greater attention to the issue of PTSD, as it found that as many as 15% of Vietnam veterans had PTSD. Over 30% of study participants had reported effects that were classified as PTSD at some point during the 15 years since the war ended. There are more veterans being treated for PTSD from Vietnam than any other war. Treatments after the war was mainly therapy at the VA, but many veterans waited several years before they began therapy because many Americans did not support the war and troops faced backlash when they returned home. Some lied about their involvement in the war, and others thought they were strong enough to fight it alone. Many of these men began relying heavily on drugs, and some overdosed or even committed suicide. Among those who faced these problems is a veteran named Warren.
When I came back, years and years I walked around. Don't know why I was having these dreams. Finding myself outside my house, in the yard pouring down raining, like I'm still in the war. Sweating, clammy hands. I didn't know what it was. I got on drugs. I drunk myself a lot because I didn't want to go to sleep. Because the dreams would get worse and worse. And it took me a long while, to look for help.
Warren is not alone. Many Vietnam veterans face similar problems due to their time in Vietnam. Unfortunately, today, new veterans continue to fall down the same path from their time in post-9/11 wars.
More recently, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, at least 20% of returning vets were diagnosed with PTSD. The past year alone, the number of diagnosed cases in the military care jumped 50%. And that's only the diagnosed cases. There's also a prevalent issue among women in the ranks who receive PTSD. Not due to combat experience, but rather sexual assault in the ranks. 71% of military personnel who were female developed MST, military sexual trauma, a sub-branch of PTSD that has growing rates every year. Fortunately, with the growing rates, treatment has advanced significantly. Most veterans seek treatment in the VA system, where they'll be offered either exposure or cognitive therapy. Exposure therapies are based on the idea that fear response that gives to many of the traumatic symptoms can be dampened through repeated exposures to the traumatic event. So treatments involve exposing veterans to the event that scarred them using virtual reality headsets and photos of video of the event. Cognitive therapies work on developing personal coping methods to stop destructive thought patterns that are contributing to the symptoms. Therapy forces the patients to understand that the event that traumatized them is over and that they must accept that they're not responsible for it. It's reported that 70% of those who have received these treatments have reported that their symptoms have been, quote, greatly improved. Unfortunately, not all veterans have access to these types of treatments. Although the VA does offer a large number of services for returning veterans, they're unable to provide these benefits in a timely manner. Receiving treatment for PTSD is a surprisingly long and demanding process. Veterans are forced to wait up to 6 months just to have their first claim reviewed. And if they're unable to get the treatment policy that they'd like after the first claim, they must wait 4 years for their case to be re-reviewed. In this time period, veterans can continue to suffer from PTSD and its horrible effects and receive no adequate treatment for it. Some veterans may even resort to suicide before then because they aren't receiving care. Suicide within the veteran community is a very prevalent issue, and it is primarily caused by PTSD. It's estimated that a former service member commits suicide every 65 minutes. That equates to 22 suicides a day. In almost all cases, the veteran has shown signs of PTSD. It's not a mere coincidence that a veteran is twice as likely to commit suicide than a normal civilian. It is very clear that our country does not do enough to protect and provide treatment for our heroes. Many lives could be saved if veterans received adequate and fast treatment for their symptoms. It must be recognized that the system must be fixed in order to protect those who protect us.
Another factor that leads to more veterans suffering is that many veterans refuse mental health screenings and treatment when they return home. While mental health concerns are very common in soldiers, research indicates that only around 50% of soldiers seek treatment when they return home. A study was performed on soldiers who meet criteria for PTSD, and it found that the negative stigma associated with PTSD is the main reason soldiers end up not pursuing treatment. It also showed people associate the words dangerous, violent, or crazy with PTSD. So they would rather go on living a fractured life, physically at home but mentally in a war, than be perceived as a crazy person by civilians. However, civilians are not the only people who judge vets based on their mental health. They also face judgment in the military itself. Many people in the military believe that those who have PTSD are not as strong as veterans who return from war unaffected. It's all based on the false notion that a soldier is no longer a soldier without courage, and the historical image of the disorder leads to this. Heroes prefer to remain silent in order to avoid being labeled as someone with a mental illness. Being labeled with any disease can bring judgments with it that are out of your control. This stigma can also have a drastic impact on how soldiers view themselves, and it can decrease their self-esteem. Internalization of these incorrect stigmas only serve to further demoralize these individuals. None of these perceptions are based in fact, and they only exacerbate the mental health condition of the individual and prevent recovery. This, combined with the tedious, ineffective process to receive treatment, causes the majority of PTSD victims to never seek treatment. Visiting a psychiatrist is the #1 factor in whether someone with PTSD will commit suicide or lose their quality of life completely. It's far too dangerous a disease to be faced outside the walls of a therapist's office. Thus, it is crucial that stigma is recognized as being wholly unhelpful and even dangerous. Discarding these notions from clouding our judgment and doing everything possible to encourage veterans to seek help is a critical step forward. Integrating PTSD into school curriculum when studying historical wars would promote an enormous change in the future military culture. We need to give this disease a nuanced perspective from a mental health angle. We can shape the minds of the upcoming generations with truth rather than rumor, and save lives in the process. When promoting PTSD awareness, it's important to keep in mind that suicide is a common symptom for this disease, so saving soldiers' lives extends beyond the battlefield. America's failure to do this is emblematic of a greater attitude. We often look at how war has the power to change the world, but the powers that shape global conflict are surprisingly human, and no human is any different than you or me. The American people and government have an obligation to support the needs of every single veteran during their transition into civilian life. We venerate our servicemen, but in the real world, they're tossed aside by their own government. What respecting the troops should really mean is providing them the necessary treatment to overcome the mental and physical trauma they experience defending our nation. Our policy must match our words on this issue because PTSD is a terrifying disease that can't be cured without professional help. So if our government is ready to send 18 and 19-year-olds to war, they better be ready to take care of them when they get back.